And welcome to this episode where I've got my soldered ABS control unit, which hopefully will now work. And obviously the silicone is now dried, and I've obviously got to put this unit back together and pop the two screws in and then refit it to the car and reconnect all our brake lines. So in this video, that's what I'll be doing. So on to assembling the three main parts back together again. So let's get these three items back together into one piece. So the control module, those two pins slide through the hydraulic unit, and then we can pop our motor onto that. I have actually put a little bit of grease onto that bearing on the outside of it, only a small amount. Okay, so that's the three pieces back together, and then we've got our two Torx bolts, the short one and the very long one, like so. So we just need to tighten those up, and for that we will use a Torx 25, like so. And we will need to torque those two bolts to 5 Newton meters. So I've got my small torque wrench here, the little mini one that goes to 20 Newton meters. So I'll set that to 5, and then we can tighten those two up. So it's probably quite important not to over tighten these, especially if they're tightening themselves inside the control module, and that's made of plastic. Okay, so we now need to go on to the bracket, and that was the 3 short bolts. So we can put those 3 bolts in, and then we can tighten those using a 10mm socket. Like so. And again, we'll finish this off with a torque wrench that's set to 8 Newton meters. So then this should be the module ready to go back on the car. I'm still hoping no air has got into that hydraulic unit, as like I said in the previous video, you do need diagnostic tooling to actually purge the air out of the pump if you get air in it. So that is one of the risks of taking this apart. So we can now refit the ABS module back onto the Mini. So this part can be somewhat fiddly, especially with all those brake pipes. Now the mistake I made here, if you notice in the picture, is the control cable is hanging out at the bottom, like so. So you don't want to do that. You want that tucked behind the legs. So I then had to pull that back out. Make sure you've got the plastic protection on that cable as well. Presumably that's to stop it chaffing against any of the metal parts, which could obviously then wear through one of the wires. So once that's back in there and seated down, I'm going to pop the 10mm bolt back in there, like so. And then we've got the 2 hex bolts at the bottom, which need to go in. You will have to wobble that around just to find the holes. So those hex bolts are actually 5mm. So we'll spin that one in and then just pop over to the other side and get that one in place. And then we can torque those to 8 Newton meters. So that's all three are torqued to 8 Newton meters. There's our click, and we've got an extra end there. One's already in there. And then lastly, we just need to do the bolt that's by the fuel cut-off switch. You just see the fuel cut-off switch there. So while knocking all these brake pipes around, I did get some brake fluid onto the multi-connector, as you can see here. Now I think that needs to come off, because I don't really want that on there. So I thought I'll blow that off with some compressed air, hopefully to get the majority of that out of the connector. I'll then give it a bit of a flood over with some WD-40 and then spray it again to clean the connectors. So hopefully that's resolved that. So I think at this point we'll get the connector on now, because brake fluid does keep dripping out from those pipes above. Okay, so on to reconnecting all the brake pipes. So I just need to remove all those little unions that I'd made to seal the hydraulic unit up. And on the unions I use, they were all 11 and 13mm. So I'm just going to undo all these. Like I say, hopefully not too much air gets in. I can't help thinking that air will actually get in when I start the bleeding process, because there's obviously air in the pipes above, and that's obviously going to get pushed down into the hydraulic unit, which is something I would have liked to have avoided, but I don't think it's avoidable. So to make myself feel a little bit more better, I'm just going to pop some brake fluid into those little holes like so. Like I said, I don't think this is really going to achieve much, but I'm going to be a bit optimistic here. But likewise, I can't actually feel the ones on the two sides, so there's probably little point in actually doing this. It's just sort of making me feel better. But anyway, right, so we can now get these pipes properly connected to the hydraulic units. So these are all 11mm, which is quite handy, because we only need the same spanner for all of it. Obviously that's the aftermarket brake that a previous garage has done. Okay, so I'll just pinch them up. I'm not tightening them too much because we do need to torque these to the correct value, and that's going to be a little bit more involved because of its location. So I'm just going to wash all the brake fluid down now, because there is brake fluid around this area and it can damage the paintwork. So, and then I'll dry that all off again with a bit of air. So to torque the brake unions, I will need to add a spanner to the torque wrench, which means a bit of maths. So I'm going to draw an artist's impression of a torque wrench, like so. This is a good quality torque wrench, as you can see, but more importantly we need to know some lengths, and that's the spanner I'm adding on the end. So we have a length of 220mm from the square drive to the centre of the handle, and the spanner is 135mm. So the maths is we need 14 Newton meters on those brake unions, and if we times that by the 220 millimeters of the torque wrench handle, and then divide all of that by the 220 plus the 135 of the spanner, and then we can break that down now. So we need to times the 14 Newton meters by the 220, and that gives us 3080. We divide that by the 220 and the 135, which is 355, and that should now give us what we need to set the torque wrench to, which should be a lot less than 14 Newton meters. Yes, and we get 8.68. So the torque wrench needs to be set at 8.68 to give us 14 Newton meters at the spanner end. Now there's another way of doing this, so I'll jot that down as well. So what you can do is 220, divide that by 135 plus the 220 again, which will give us 355, and then times that by the 14 Newton meters, and we should get the same result. So we'll go back to the calculator, and thankfully for us, or me, we do 8.68 again. Now there is a third option here, and since we've all got mobile phones, we could download the Norbar app, which probably simplifies things all over again. So if we just simply put in the length of the torque wrench and then the length with the spanner on, which is the 355, and we want 14 Newton meters, we get our answer at 8.6761 Newton meters. So we can now set the torque wrench to that lower figure and pop our spanner on the end, making sure it's straight. It's got to be straight for the maths to actually make sense. But this way we can actually get the spanner onto the unions and still torque them correctly. Otherwise it might be quite difficult to get in there. So you can use a crow's foot. I actually have got some crow's foot ends, but ironically they won't fit in, so it did have to be a spanner. Alternatively, you could actually put a crow's foot on the end of the torque wrench, and as long as it's at 90 degrees to the end, in theory that would still be the same length roughly, and you could do the 14 Newton meters that way. But anyway, so now to replace all the other parts that I've previously removed. So we'll get this plastic shield back in behind those two bottles. There's a bit of weather protection there, I presume. That's one thing that BMW have actually done, is they have actually protected all the braking parts quite nicely. They are behind little plastic shields. Okay, so we've got to replace the plastic fixing here in the corner. It's quite tight, that is. Pop that in, and then we need to put our weather strip back on. Like I say, they've tucked it away quite nicely. Don't need to do the other side just yet. We need to wait for the battery to get back in. So we've now got to put this bracket back on. So you've got 4 bolts there, 13mm socket for these. So that is actually still attached to the heat shield that's just above the catalytic converter. So I can just spin these in now a bit quicker, and then we will need to get our torque wrench, and these are torqued to 19 Newton meters. So there we go, we'll quickly get 4 clicks on that, 2, 3 and 4, and we can now go on to the coolant bottle. Now make sure you don't over tighten that, could be quite disastrous. And that's a 13mm socket, and that's only tightened to 5 Newton meters. And then onto the power steering bottle. Again, you don't want to over tighten that in case you crack it. And I seem to have 3 nuts. They're all different, but they are all the same size at least. So I'm just going to tighten those up, and again that's with a 10mm socket, and they're tightened to 8 Newton meters. Now the one for the bottle though is 5.5 Newton meters, and you definitely don't want to over tighten that. So for me, I've got to put the battery box back in again, which isn't that easy because you've got these 3 clips underneath which are holding a positive battery lead that's going to a fuse box, I think. You've got to carefully pop that down without trapping that positive cable. That could be quite disastrous. Could warm things up. So that's sat down nicely. Just making sure that positive cable is free and it's not trapped. So my top left bolt is actually broken and missing, but I've got 3 other bolts there I can pop back in. And again, these are 10mm. I put a bit of copper grease on those this time, so that hopefully I can get them out next time. Now what I found for the front bolt was using something like this retriever tool was quite handy, because I could just sort of pop the bolt down and spin it around until it bit, and then remove it, and then tighten that. Job's done. So then we've got to remember to put that little panel in near the ABS pump. There it is. Just slide that down, because the weather strip will go along that. So we ought to put the brains of the car back in now. So we've got 2 connectors there with a lot of pins on. I think might need to put that into position first. If you drop it down though, it clips and gets stuck down there. So you sort of perhaps want to put the cables on before you drop it. Like so. Then that clips into place. And we can put the battery in. Now I noticed when I took the battery out that the terminals were heavily corroded. So I think I'm just going to spin this round and get some of that corrosion off. I don't think the corrosion is going to help with power transfer. And with this little tool you can actually reverse it, and there's a brush in the end. So I think I'll give the clamps a bit of a spin as well. You see the dust coming off there? That's probably lead oxide. Probably best not breathing that in. And what we do to one, we do to the other, so we do the positive as well. You definitely don't want to stab yourself with this brush, because those bristles are pretty strong. Okay, so that should be better. So we put positive on first so that we can't accidentally short it, and then again that's a 10mm socket to tighten that up. And then we can go on to the negative now. Pop that one on, and again that's 10mm. Not sure of the torque of these, so it's not too tight. I've done those hand tight. Now normally you'd actually put a bit of petroleum jelly over that, over the terminals, just to give them some protection. Now this vent pipe was on this side, but it actually sort of, the vent it's been vented at the other side. So I'll leave it as I found it. But I think I'm supposed to actually pull the little plug out just down there and pop that in. So we just need to secure this battery with its bracket. Again, they're 10mm, and I'm just doing those hand tight. I'm not sure on the torque settings for those either. Okay, then just pop the cover back on, like so. I've got a few broken clips there, so it's not going to stay in place. So we can now pop the weather sealing strip on there. Like I say, that protects the ABS control module quite nicely. Stops it getting any corrosion. And then obviously take the piece of cling film off, like so. I will need to bleed all the brakes after this, so give it a quick check over, make sure I haven't left any tools in there, anything silly like that. Nothing up there. Looking good. Shut the bonnet, and then we just need to remove the two extensions that are just slightly depressing the brake pedal, with the idea being it avoids fluid leaking. Hopefully that worked. So you've been watching how to refit an ABS control module to your Mini 1 R50. And thank you for watching, and I hope this video helps you have a better understanding of your Mini ABS control module. This video was filmed and edited by me, Mark Savage, in June 2021, and I can be found on Instagram and Facebook as Coats and Gators.